Any normal day. Graham did his best to behave completely normally, but it was only through sheer force of will that he was able to even approach such a state. That and spending time hidden in his compartment playing solitaire whenever possible were what helped him make any believable pretense at all. It was a surprise to him how hard it was to simply act like he would on any other day. That the situation was unprecedented was true, but his job was, at its core, simply one long act, and he'd done fine through any number of serious situations. There were few actual skills required for the job he held, which was arguably the most important one in the silo. Of those skills, acting like everything was normal ranked at the top of the list. Pretending like everything was in control followed closely behind, and occasionally doing things one might otherwise find absolutely reprehensible rounded out the top three. According to his uncle, the careful cultivation of an exterior personality that combined being an asshole with a desire to do nothing except work was a bonus, but not absolutely required as a fourth skill for the job. Uncle Newt had been a jolly fellow with a genuinely caring core and quick sense of humor at home. The first time Graham had seen his uncle at work, trailing behind him as he was evaluated, all unknowing, for the job he held now, he had been amazed at how different the man behaved. He wasn't mean exactly, just not at all nice. And people had seemed to fear him. Graham had embarrassed himself mightily on that first day when he started crying in his uncle's office as he listened to him yelling at someone outside the door. Back in the office, Uncle Newt had knelt down in front of the chair Graham was ensconced in with his feet barely touching the floor, and turned back into the lovable man Graham had always known. He had been right when he told Graham that he had to be that way for reasons a little boy wouldn't understand. He'd been equally right when he told him that someday he would understand if all went well. It was so simple now to see how right his uncle had been. So much of what Graham had heard and seen then was completely clear to him now, things that would have been incomprehensible back then. Uncle Newt had been one of the rare ones. He had been the head of IT for more than 20 years, one of the few to hold the position that long. Alas, Graham wasn't cut out for asshole-dom of any sort. He was firm when needed, nice when permitted, but always a good person. Even his wife had been nice, bringing platters of baked goods or treats of some sort and passing them out, office to office, as she asked after families. In his decades as head they had experienced only 4 cleanings, the last one actually done under duress from Silo 1 because it had been too long since the previous cleaning. Even then, he had picked someone who was close to death and had no close family, carefully parsing each record for the right person. She was as alone as anyone could be in the silo where everyone was tied by blood and proximity to one extent or another. He had sat by the woman's bedside, telling her of the unease in the silo and the dirty censors and his fears. He told her the secret to peace in the silo, the cleanings. She had volunteered then and Graham felt dirtier than the censors she would soon clear of their debris. It was the kind of filth that lived inside the soul and could never be washed away. She said the words and went to the cell. When Graham had made sure there was a pouch filled with an overdose of poppy extract installed in her helmet so she would feel no pain, she had actually winked at him. Before they put on her helmet and her face disappeared from view forever, she had placed a hand withered by illness and age on the arm of the IT worker to stay him a moment. She turned to the little round window through which Graham watched and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Graham hadn't been able to stop the tears from flowing then and said the same back to her, earning him a confused and vaguely suspicious look from the sheriff standing nearby. What she saw outside was the best his people had ever done. It had been a true work of art. She had been a teacher, his teacher once upon a time when he was very small. He'd asked her what her favorite thing was from the children's books after she agreed to say the words and earn herself a death sentence. She had thought about it, her eyes soft with memories, and told him it was the birds. She thought it might be wonderful to be able to fly and not have to use the stairs all the time. He'd asked her if she could keep a secret and she had nodded, eyes widening at the secret smile on his face. He had leaned low and whispered so softly in her ear that it might have been wind, but she had heard him and her own smile was heartbreaking in its belief and hope. He had whispered that she would have birds. So he had the programmers add birds, lots and lots of happy birds. He had put in birds that flew high, flew low, and even added a colorful variety of them circling the sensors, luring her there with their colors and chirps. They ensured she would follow the cleaning procedure and stay close to the sensors. She had. But she had been the last one to clean, and Graham wouldn't hear anything more on the subject when Silo 1 brought it up. They weren't insistent, even though the sensors that showed the population their view of the blasted lands outside were caked with dust. Nothing in this silo even hinted at an uprising, so why bother? With his population dropping like it was, such a thing would be as stupid as it was unnecessary. Almost no one even went up to level 1 that didn't actually have to go there. Even the sheriff and his deputy had moved their main offices to level 5. As he shuffled cards for yet another game of solitaire, the cards soft and worn with use, he thought he really should get out and try to get some work done. It was just hard to bring himself to open the door and walk out of his compartment again. Inside, he felt like all his insides were having a party and dancing about inside his chest without a care for the one that held them safely inside. More than once he felt a lurch in his chest so strong that his breath caught, and he feared the stress of holding his secrets would kill him. Still, he did his best to reserve his shakes and hand-wringing for when he was sure he was alone and in a place unlikely to be observed, like the shower or here, playing cards all alone. Graham slapped the deck of cards down on the table. Enough of this moping around, he decided. With a fresh kerchief pulled from the clean laundry pile, or what he thought was the clean pile, he stepped out into the hallway. A little socializing, a little FaceTime with workers, and a little movement would be good for him and make the time till Silo 1 forgot about him go faster. As he walked down the hallway toward the landing, he felt good, almost to the point of smiling. Before he reached the landing door, he met up with a neighbor from a couple of doors down. Mary Bell gave him one of her charming smiles and stopped to discuss housekeeping on their level. Drugged or not, Mary Bell was a whirlwind of organization and seemed to be the constant driving force behind maintaining their level in some semblance of order. She marshaled her kids around the level, picking up debris on a regular basis, and made the rest of them feel guilty in the doing. It always made people help. She was good. "Oh, Graham, you're just the man I wanted to see. Got a minute?" she asked, plucking an invisible bit of lint from her immaculate pink coveralls as she pulled up next to him. "Sure," he responded, trying to smile. She saw the pained look and asked, "You okay?" "Always, Mary Bell." "Always," he answered. "I've just been busy. You know how it is." She nodded, a look of commiseration on her face. Graham knew that she understood all too well. They were all busy. "Well," she said, her tone returning to a businesslike one. "We need to get a more regular schedule for cleaning up this level than we have. It's getting disgusting and staying that way longer between clean-up days. Don't you think?" Graham looked around and saw she was right. The truth was that he had become used to it and only really saw it when it started to become really rank. Burlap bags of vegetable material ready to be taken to composting littered the hallway. Crowded in amongst those were bags of other recycling or just plain trash, some of them weeping dark stains onto the floor. The big brown bags meant for dirty laundry stood sentry beside each compartment door, some with their contents spilling out into the walkway between. Burned out or flickering lights gave the entire hallway the disused look of some place soon to be abandoned. "It's pretty bad, isn't it?" It was a lame response and he knew it. "I've tried to talk to Wallace about it, but he's always busy, too. Besides, I don't think we should need the mayor just to get people to clean up their own level. We should be able to do it ourselves." It was a reasonable thing to say, but Graham could see the frustration on her face and hear it in her voice. "Would you be willing to set up a roster? Could you check the work schedules and talk to people? You can certainly put me on the roster." He thought for a moment and added, "There really aren't enough maintainers to push the issue." She tapped a finger on her chin, evaluating the hallway with her lips pursed. Finally, she gave one firm nod and straightened. "You're right. We have to take care of anything we can take care of. Maribel paused and looked up at Graham, her expression earnest. Her voice was soft when she spoke again. We have to take care of each other, don't we? That did it for Graham, though Maribel had no way of knowing that. She was so right. Her words went to the heart of the matter, even if she didn't realize it. If they didn't do for each other, who would do for them? It was his turn to do for these people, and instead of thinking getting to work he had been sitting in his compartment playing cards and feeling sorry for himself. He wanted to say something profound, but when he tried to respond, the urge to blurt out what he was trying to hide was so strong he choked. He pulled the kerchief from his pocket and pressed it to his mouth with so much force it looked like he was trying to stuff it into his mouth, past his gritted teeth. The moment passed, the urge with it. Maribel looked at him first with concern and then with the beginnings of alarm. He tried to explain it away. Sorry, he choked out, his voice as tight as a drum. I thought I was going to sneeze all over you for a minute there. It was stupid, but it was all he could think of. Maribel's gaze was an evaluating one and he tried to smooth any strain from his face. From her expression, he wasn't doing well. Finally, she gave a little shake of her head and said, Graham, don't worry about it. It's not so bad. I'll take care of it. You go on. He did his best to ignore the lingering cautious look she gave him and shuffled off in a hurry after one last wave. That had been embarrassing as well as dangerous, and he kept his head down as he made his way toward administration to check in and get the list of jobs he needed to parse out for his crew in IT. Taking up a little slack wherever he could was all he had to offer, though it was going to require a little selling on his part to add yet more to the work list in IT. As he entered IT, his lists in his hands, Tony appeared. It was almost as if he had some sort of sensor that was specifically tuned to Graham. He got exactly one step past the turnstiles when the toad made his irritating throat-clearing noise and said, Hiya, boss. Graham felt his jaw go tight. It was an effort, but he plastered a distant smile, the smile of a boss, on his face and kept walking toward his office. He inclined his head for Tony to follow and the younger man hurried after him, his clipboard at high ready. He knew it wasn't fair of him to dislike Tony the way he did. He was very good at what he did and probably did deserve to take the shadow spot Silo One had been after him to fill from almost the very moment of his former shadow's death. That was a moot point now, since he had other plans, but even before then, there was something about Tony that made him cringe. To have someone like him be the next in line almost seemed like a defeat, like the absolute power of Silo One had found a perfect receptacle for the wielding of their will. Have a seat, Tony, Graham said as he took his seat behind the desk and picked up a stack of messages from the surface. We've got a lot to do, I'm sure, but I'm going to add to that list, so we'd best get started. Less than 10 minutes later, a flustered Tony left with a much expanded work list and a whole lot of arranging to do. It made Graham feel something close to normal to know that nothing else was going wrong and necessary things were getting done even without him. After that, things went well, so it wasn't an entirely lost day. As long as he was able to do what needed doing remotely, using the impersonal communications of the wires, then he was able to keep that facade in place. He could do things without a person to look at and backspace when his fumbling caused mistakes. Also, writing the words inarticulate scream didn't carry the same impact as actually doing it, so he felt no temptation to do that in a wire. It was with relief that he wired down to each of the water plants to lower the additive levels. They had no idea what it was, of course. It was labeled as a water additive just like every other additive, but the regular water workers could adjust the concentrations on the conditioning machines. It was good that they could, because he had enough worries just trying to figure out how the last remaining IT agent that worked in chemistry would be able to manufacture and deliver the next load of additives, let alone how that same fellow would get to every plant just to twiddle a knob or push a button. He knew from a lifetime of experience how fast the dosing took effect when it was turned on and how quickly it faded when turned off. He could expect some slight improvement right away, but the improvement was often a dubious form of goodness. There was always someone who would break from remembered grief or whose confusion might manifest in an act against the order. His experience of dosing was both personal and professional. As a child, he had been no different from any other member of the silo up until the moment his uncle had decided he would make a good successor. Until that moment, he had been subject to whatever might be added to the water just like everyone else. The minor uprising that happened when he was small hadn't affected him personally nor done anything more than bring about some confusion to his young mind. It was a mostly verbal confrontation, punctuated by distant skirmishes, over power between almost identical factions within administration and law. But it had resulted in a lot of cleanings. The water had been dosed with comatives during the event, which did end it more quickly than it might otherwise have. Afterwards, a minor dose of the forgetting drugs had been administered and, as a child not much impacted by the uprising, it did little but smooth out the memories Graham carried. That was not true of others, including his parents, whose foggy memories of that time had been a puzzle to his childhood self. He remembered hearing about one of those cleanings. There were several over a period of a few days when whoever was outside decided revenge didn't stop with death. Apparently, the cleaner had done all that was expected, but had then stumbled around like a blind man, feeling about on the ground like a person looking for a lost shit in the dark. Eventually, he had found and then fallen down on top of another recent cleaner and proceeded to beat and kick the corpse until he finally succumbed in his turn. According to the story he heard later, when he was old enough to understand it, it had caused equal amounts mirth and anger in the population, but nothing came of it in the end. Even then, as a young teen not yet aware of all the truths he would learn in the years ahead of him, he had been appalled at anyone laughing at anything related to a cleaning. But those stories always seemed to be limited to the young or those who had no personal feelings about the situation. Had he been smarter, perhaps a bit more cynical, he would have figured out more about this world before it was told to him. Maybe he would have understood before it was too late to avoid being a part of it. Later, during his shadowing years, his uncle told him about the dosing and when it was done and how it worked. Then he understood the reactions, or lack of reactions, that he saw around him. There was more than one form of dosing and the stronger version was used only when true forgetting was needed. It worked on things one thought about that caused negative feelings, not everything in a person's memory. At least that is what it was supposed to do and had done until this most recent usage. If something didn't concern you or cause a bad feeling, the memories stayed almost intact and just smoothed it out a little. The memory was there, but it was one without emotion, and he thought that probably explained why the young and uninvolved remembered events of import better than those that lived the events as adults. Strong and long doses of the forgetting drug could be used to leave a person completely open to having their entire life rewritten into a new story that the person would never question. Such hadn't been done in Silo 49 that Graham was aware of, but in other silos it happened with regularity every generation or so. Then again, how would he even know if it had been done? What a thought that was! There had been no uprisings of any kind during Graham's tenure, or even during his shadowing, but he had been directed to use the dosing several times over the years when certain stressors were present. The order was clear on almost every situation, and dosing was often the first answer it provided. The words, "See entry on dosing," were the directions for IT heads after more events than he thought possible. It was almost funny, except that it wasn't funny at all. Conspiracy for dinner. Graham dutifully went to the uppermost medical bay and had a meeting with the last medic still left to that station. He was a wonderfully caring young man, though 40 really wasn't that young, except when compared with Graham's more than 60, and he did a fine job of taking care of the residents of the upper levels. His memory was affected, like so many others, but he was doing what he could to keep up. They talked in the Level 1 cafeteria about the records and his intentions. It was a strange feeling to be there in the cafeteria, empty even during this prime period during the day. The view, thrown on the wall in projection from the sensors outside, was dim and brown. The grit and dirt on the ablative film that kept the sensors from being eroded away was itself now pitted and hazy. A small hole worn into the film, its edges ragged, made it look like one was peering through a peephole. If the situation were normal inside Silo 49, then surely Graham knew he would be under a great deal of pressure to find a cleaner and set the view to rights. All that he could see, beyond the brownish haze that obscured the sensors, was the same blowing dirt and dust he had seen his whole life. The sky was the sickly color of a bruise healed to the brown and yellow stage, and the air itself seemed to boil with yet more dust being blown far harder than the breezes of the silo would ever blow. He flinched when a sudden gust threw a solid wall of deep brown grit toward the sensor. It was gone as quickly as it came, traveling toward what Graham knew were other silos. No one else knew that though. The medic, who also watched the screen as they spoke, looked away from the sensors after that gust, as if he couldn't bear the thought of seeing more obscuring dirt on the sensors. Graham coughed, like the dust was tickling his throat, and returned his wandering attention to the medic. "So you can find all of those records?" he asked, hoping the young medic would say he couldn't. He nodded, smiling and happy to be of service. Graham's lips gave a twist, but he dampened it quickly and cleared his throat. "Well, how long would it take?" The medic considered, his eyes darting toward the view for a moment, then said, "Actually, I should say that I can locate them, but they won't all be there." At Graham's look, he added, "We don't keep the whole record forever. That's a lot of paper. After a few years, we create a summary sheet and then recycle the record. Just enough information to approve matches is what gets retained forever." Graham tried not to smile at that. A simple summary sheet for every person was retained for use in approving marriage matches as the generations passed, but they contained no details. That was good. He wanted to take no chances that this energetic young man might start scanning in documents and perhaps give the others what they needed before he was ready for them, so he kept a serious face as he gave his directions. He had to be subtle about how he went about his delaying tactics. He wanted to give every impression that he was doing exactly what the voices in Silo 1 had instructed him to do, despite the fact that he had absolutely no intention of ever finishing any such task to their satisfaction. After the medic left, hurrying down that first spiral of stairs and out of sight, Graham sat in the silent cafeteria by himself. He watched the view with its never-ending display of filthy deadness outside and sipped from his canteen of tea. He thought about what he was doing, what he was planning, and how he had come to this point. Even if the conversation he'd overheard hadn't been one that concluded with a decision to kill his silo, he would be delaying or not doing this tasking. He felt betrayed, but not just for himself. He felt that betrayal for everyone that lived in Silo 49. He had been led to believe that each silo was precious and represented the last hope of mankind. He had been told that all they did was for the future. He had believed it all and justified every bad act, every cleaning, and every lie because he believed it. It turned out that wasn't true at all. His people had become an interesting set of medical circumstances to be collected, collated, and filed away. Silo 1 cared nothing for them as people. To them, it wasn't the legacy that mattered because these people, however sick, were still the seeds of that legacy. It was a perfect legacy that mattered to them, and this silo was tainted based on their perfect standards. Tainted, no longer wanted, and in need of discarding. He wouldn't have it. He wouldn't allow it. He didn't know the precise moment when he had stopped believing in the absolute rightness of Silo 1. He thought it had eroded in stages, dropping off of him in layers like the rust that seemed to wear away the bones of the Silo 1 thin flake at a time. That made it very hard for him to define any specific moment in time for the loss of his belief, but he did know that every shred of whatever faith had remained fell away with that overheard conversation. Now that he had heard them as they were, without whatever carefully chosen words they used to deceive and control, he realized that they were only madmen without scruples. For Graham, there was no other possible explanation other than madness of some sort. He had been raised for the position he held in the silo. He had shadowed from the early age of 15 for it, and for more than 20 years he had remained a shadow even as he watched others his age progress in their careers and gain authority and trust. He had been patient and remained true to his purpose through it all. When his uncle had succumbed to cancer, like so many others had after him, choking on blood and begging for death, Graham had slipped the key from his uncle's neck and around his own. He had been secure in the knowledge of his place in this world. When the two keys had clinked together under his coveralls, he had felt alone, but also strangely ready and confident. He had trusted the process. He had trusted the order. He had trusted that all would come to fruition as it should if he only did the right things. All that had gone from him over the years and the last now blown away like the dust outside. He wondered if his uncle had felt this same loss of faith and confidence. He thought back but found nothing in his memory that stood out. Like all the heads of IT before him, his uncle had trained Graham just as hard in what to hide from Silo 1 as what to tell them. Could that be construed as a loss of faith, or were those merely the practical habits of a man that understood the squishy reality behind such firm rules? Though he would never know for sure, Graham thought that his uncle had died a believer. He was intensely envious of that. And now he was old, and in one fell swoop he had become cynical and terribly afraid. Decades had passed since he took that second key, and even though this overheard exchange had tipped the scales of both his belief and his loyalty, he had to admit to himself that any actual conviction he might have felt all those years before had been gone a very long time. He capped his canteen again and took one last look at the darkening view outside. He'd been sitting in the hard cafeteria chair, ruminating, for far too long, and day outside was waning. This time of day, when the sun boiled at the horizon and made the air shimmer as it shone directly into the sensor, it was almost pretty out there. That was something he couldn't admit out loud, but it was still true. The shadows were long and the lumps made of long-dead cleaners or their shredded remains were mostly hidden. The dust seemed less pervasive and it was just shadows and the entrancing deep orange light. He sighed as he got up and started down the spiral stairs, careful in his steps lest he fall with no one anywhere nearby to hear any cry for help. His careful and mostly solitary day and a half had passed without incident, and he felt the familiar tingles he associated with being watched leave him, just as he thought it would. He didn't know if it was merely psychological or if there was some part of him that simply understood their process deeply enough to know when they would watch. Whatever it was, he felt certain their interest in him had faded for the moment. His steps quickened on the stairs. They would wait for him to complete his work and then kill him, but for now, they had moved on to something else. He put his thoughts of the past back into the deep recesses of his mind and made ready to act on all that he had spent the last day thinking about. He could do what he needed to do and gain the help he needed to get it done. His steps lightened for the first time as he rounded the stairwell to level 5 and left the dark silence of the empty level 4 behind. All the apartments on levels 4 and 6 were now closed, their landings quiet and the interiors dark. Chains glimmered dully from the handles of the big double doors under the lights of the landing. It was sad to see, but it had eventually become a necessity with so few people to monitor the conditions of the empty floors. He quickly did what he needed to in his quarters. When he was done, he felt less burdened as he made his way toward the compartment of the exact friend he needed. Anyone left from these upper residential levels had moved to level 5 over the past few years. Most of them had spread out to more than one compartment, using one for sleeping and another as a study or a place to perform the many duties each had been required to take on as the population diminished. Graham was no different in that respect. The whole of IT was in a degraded state, maintaining itself only minimally and doing so with a skeleton staff. He hated it. He hated going down there and seeing the dirty tiles and the smeared glass and the boxes of junk parts lying around. It made him feel like he had failed, but he couldn't see how it could possibly be right to take labor needed elsewhere just so IT could stay fully staffed. The priorities were mechanical in all aspects of food production. They needed the most complete staffing. After all, it wouldn't matter much if the servers survived if the lights went out or the food stopped coming. To do his part, he took on a few additional roles as well. He did some repair work for IT as well as being the head. He also took transport duty as needed, which everyone physically capable of doing also did. He did shifts on the dim watch, patrolling to be sure that all was well and quiet on levels 1 through 5. Like most everyone else, he chipped in where he could, wherever it was needed. Sometimes he might help sand away rust, prime and paint rails or pipes. Other times he might simply be needed to help with administrative work. It varied, but there was always a need for more labor than they had. To do all this and still sleep, he had spread out to 2 compartments and worked from an office that had once been a compartment large enough to house an entire family. What he most liked about Level 5 was that these were all generic apartments, never designated for anyone that held any specific role. He felt unwatched there and safer than he did anywhere else in the silo. He missed the luxury of the apartment usually reserved for the one who held his job, but this little space was less visible. For that reason alone, he loved it. On the same level also lived the man who was the new acting mayor and, as chance would have it, Graham's oldest friend. He was the last of the people he could still trust like he trusted himself and the one Graham needed to talk to. It was toward his compartment that he headed. What was coming would be awkward, to say the least. He was about to go in and tell his best friend of more than 50 years that he had known vital and different truths for most of those years and never told him. Yes, it was going to be awkward. But he felt lighter just knowing he was going to get this off his chest. Wallace was a goof, but he was a smart and savvy goof. He needed that mind on his side. As Graham carried a bucket of freshly steamed corn toward his friend's apartment, he dodged bags of dirty laundry and bins of sorted garbage left in the halls. There were few maintainers, since maintainers mostly came from the porter specialty once their knees or hips went, so Mary Bell was right about them needing to get to work. Without them, these piles would only be removed sporadically, if at all. It had gotten worse. Soon enough it would get so bad that either he or one of his neighbors would get fed up with the smell and start banging on doors until everyone came out and pitched in to remove it. That didn't happen often enough though, and the air was thick with the odors of unwashed clothing and decaying vegetable matter. When this was all over, he would be sure to help Mary Bell get this sorted. This trip down the hall with food was not an uncommon one for Graham and would not be out of character if he was being observed in some fashion. The acting mayor and he had gone to school together, married just months apart, and lived their lives in near tandem. Even their parents had been fast friends. Now they had even more in common. Both of them had lost a wife and their only child to what was killing the whole silo in one way or another. Graham's wife was gone to cancer, while Wallace had lost his to a fall, politely described as an accident. There were differences in the paths of their lives, but only in the most heartbreaking ways, and they had grown closer to each other with each new tragedy. Graham and his wife had managed to fall pregnant just once during their long marriage. His daughter had been small but more beautiful than anything Graham had ever laid his eyes upon. Her little bud of a mouth and soft black hair were a miracle to Graham, but those pink lips had turned blue quickly, and the feeling of loss almost crushed him when she breathed her last so soon after coming into the world. Neither of them had wanted to try again. The situation was never discussed, but his wife had quietly gone and had an implant put in that would prevent another pregnancy. Graham had felt the tiny lump in the course of their lives but, like her, never spoken about it. For Wallace and his wife, the experience was different but Graham thought it must have been even harder to live through. Pregnancies came one after the other for that couple, yet all of them ended in miscarriage until their boy had finally come screaming and healthy into the world. That son had died at 12 years of age from some cancer of the blood. Just days later, the boy's mother joined her son when she decided to fall. Since then, it had become habit for the two men to eat together more often than not and keep each other company. At first, it was under a cloud of despair as both tried to continue living in the face of so much loss. When special days came around they provided silent support to the other to get through the day. When the sadness struck one of them particularly hard for no apparent reason, the other would produce a pack of cards or a game or just some distracting conversation. In those first years, the temptation to tell Wallace the truth about this world had been almost irresistible. But he had resisted and with the passage of years, the temptation had waned. Over time, they had both settled into a new sort of life and had provided to each other a companionship much like that of close brothers. In their own ways, they had developed a sort of resigned contentment and helped the other to forget what could be forgotten. If only Graham could indulge in the water. If only he could let Wallace do the same. Today's bucket, bristling with the bright yellow ears and speckled with spices, provided a believable cover for Gram as he sought help from the only person who might believe what he said or even understand it. Gram felt better just knowing he would have an ally. At Wallace's door, he knocked, then held out the bucket in invitation as it opened. Wallace clapped him on the shoulder in welcome as he crossed the threshold and said, "About time. I'm starving." He stopped and looked at Gram, actually seeing his friend with his hollowed eyes and stressed expression. He said, "You look like you haven't slept in days. You okay?" Once inside and with the door closed, Gram plunked the bucket down unceremoniously on a littered table and said, "I need your help. You might want to sit down." "Okay," Wallace answered, eyeing the bucket of corn. "Can it wait till after we eat? I'm not joking about being starving, you know." He sucked in his gut dramatically and slapped at his belly, but his smile belied his words. He was just cheerful and couldn't seem to stop himself. "Not that kind of help," Gram answered, trying to figure out exactly how he was going to do this and not get punched. He would deserve a punch or two. "We can eat while you help me." Wallace rubbed his hands together and said, "Right. Tea. And napkins. Get comfortable, why don't you?" Gram took the bucket and scooted some junk around on the low living room table to make room for it while Wallace busied himself with the business of making tea, humming a little tune as he did. He was glad to see that his friend was using the containers of farm water to make the tea. He had already done all that he could to keep Wallace safe and with his wits intact without telling forbidden truths. He had ensured that Wallace received water tapped before it was processed through the dosing machines. Gram and Wallace were both drinking straight farm water now. The water they were drinking came from the upper water treatment plant, the one that brought the highest levels of contamination to those that drank from it, but Gram could see no help for that. He tried not to imagine what poison leached into his body whenever he drank. When Wallace had asked why Gram wanted him to drink only from the big containers he hated hauling, he had lied, and his lie was just believable enough for his friend. Gram hadn't been able to face the idea of being alone in his memory. It was bad enough seeing the dullness come over everyone else, but he wouldn't have been able to survive without at least one other undimmed person. Wallace was getting some dosing, of course, and there was nothing Gram could do about that. The tea in communal spaces, a quick drink of water at some handy faucet during the day, or even the water left on vegetables washed before being served meant he couldn't escape it entirely. But that little bit hadn't dulled Wallace, and he was almost as quick as ever. Gram was getting that much as well. There was simply no way to avoid it completely, but these small amounts seemed to have no real effect on either man. Wallace waved him over to grab the tea while he carried in the other necessaries. Once they had settled and Wallace dug into the fragrant, but rapidly cooling, ears of corn, Gram decided it was now or never. "So, Wallace, you know I don't have a shadow anymore, right?" Without a pause in his rapid nibble along the ear of corn, Wallace nodded and grunted something that sounded vaguely like a yes. The way his eyebrows drew together told Gram he didn't understand the point of the question. "Well, a big part of my job involves stuff no one except my shadow and myself are supposed to know about," he said by way of explanation, and then trailed off, trying to work everything out in his mind. Wallace finished his first ear and dropped the gnawed cob into a smelly and overfull bin meant for compost material. He grabbed another in hands already dripping with juice and asked, "You want me to be your shadow or something? Because, if that is what you're after, I gotta tell you I'm fully employed already." That actually wasn't a bad thought. In a way, he was enlisting Wallace as a shadow of sorts. Unlike his uncle, Gram had no shadow to take over for him should the worst happen. And if anything happened to him right now, before he could do what he needed, the silo would be lost. And the only shadow he could handle after what had happened to the boy he had thought of as a son was Wallace. His shadow had died before his 30th birthday. He had wasted away until the doctor gave him that single big dose of concentrated poppy extract that he gave to all those whose pain grew too great. There was not enough of the extract to manage the pain of a long decline. Even when crops were displaced to increase the space for the flowers, there was no way to tend and process as much as they would need. There just weren't enough farmers or chemists. So, people like his shadow suffered until the suffering was too great and then their suffering ended. That was it. A medic was called, and with him came his little bottle of painless death. Gram had cared for his shadow as best he could, but eventually the young man had called for the bottle. He had cried and held his bony hand as the lines of pain eased away and he regained his youth, even if only briefly and in death. Gram shook those dark thoughts of the past away and grabbed one of the ears of corn and said, "Okay. You know how you've always thought we were the only silo.